So I believe we now are coming up to that time when we have our first two speakers, Sally Nash and Stephen Pattison, who are going to be specifically talking about shame and the church. So I'm going to hand over now to Sally and to Stephen to begin your conversation. Welcome to both of you.
Okay, thanks very much, Catherine. Quick introduction. I'm Sally. I studied shame in the church as part of my ordination training, which is why I'm wearing my dog collar today, because I want to own that I'm part of the church. You know, I'm a priest in the church, of which I have some concerns around shame. And Stephen was my supervisor for the PhD that I did, and I'll leave him to say what else he'd like to say about himself.
I'm also an Anglican priest, and I thought about wearing a clerical collar this morning to take responsibility both for the shame I feel about the church and the shame feel about myself, pretending that I should be the sort of person who should wear a dog collar. 40 years I've been feeling that, so it's still not gone away, Sally. Nice to see. And I hope, if nothing else happens, people know about your wonderful book, Shame in the Church, and we'll be talking a little bit about that. And if you haven't got it, I hope you'll go out and buy it today, folks. So that's an unsolicited kind of endorsement of this very new book, which I really enjoyed reading, and I hope we'll talk a bit about it.
Thank you. I think we wanted to begin by going back to your book, which was, I think, one of the early books on shame from the UK perspective. So 20 years ago, you published Shame Therapy and Theology. How do you think things have changed in the church in the last 20 years in relation to shame?
Yeah, thank you for asking me that. I mean, I've thought a lot about that over the last few days and thinking about this conversation. And of course, I would like to say that it's all got a whole lot better and that shame is less of an issue than it was. But I think the fact that we're having this conversation this morning suggests that it isn't less of an issue than it was. The good news, I think, is that it's more conscious, that people are more aware of it. And, you know, your book and Judith's book and books by other people who are on this call testify to the fact that people are getting more interested in it and becoming more aware of it as an issue and a problem. But knowing more about it and how it works and so on isn't the same thing as having addressed it in all its forms and so on. So I was thinking, last week we were talking about child abuse in the Church of England. I'm a member of the Church of England and have permission to officiate in the Church of England. If I was an abused person, thinking about how I hadn't been heard by bishops and how my experience of being deafed out, I wouldn't be thinking the Church of England was doing a great job on shame. If I was a person who was a gay cleric married to another gay cleric and living a celibate life because that was the only way I was allowed to continue to be a cleric, I wouldn't be thinking the church was doing a great job on shame. If I was a trans person thinking about what my value was in the eyes of the church and in the eyes of God, I wouldn't be thinking that, say, the Church of England was doing a great job on shame. So I think the good news is we perhaps know more about what it does and how it works. And I think we should talk about your typology in that connection. But I'm not sure that we're kind of much further forward in terms of kind of actually addressing shame in individuals or in our community or beyond our community. I don't know, what do you think, Sally?
Yeah, I suppose when I first started wanting to do this this PhD 10 years ago, we started having conversations about what I was going to do. I don't think there was very much from the UK perspective. I would probably say the last 5 years, the idea of shame has got more prevalent. I think partly due to Brené Brown's work. Every time I mention shame, she would get mentioned. She's for anyone who hasn't come across her, she's an academic from America who has largely been doing things like training social workers. Although she is a person of faith, she doesn't really bring that sort of that dimension very much into her writing. And then I think what's now being called sort of cancel culture, John Ronson's book, You've Been Shamed, I think has brought the idea of shame a little bit more into the public consciousness. But yeah, I think there's a growing awareness, but I think I'm not sure how good the church is yet to become at addressing some of the issues. I would put out some stuff on social media last night, asked about shame, and one of my friends replied with her blog as a survivor of clerical sexual abuse and how it feels. And I mean, it brought tears to my eyes. Reading that, and I know that she is concerned that thus far she hasn't seen very much that feels that her shame is being ameliorated by what the church is doing, although hopefully the most recent report and some statements coming out will help on that. Yeah, Stephen, you mentioned my typology, and as someone who's main thrust over the last sort of 20, 30 years has been training youth workers, I'm very keen on sort of how we think about work with people and how that translates into what we do with the church. And in looking at the typology, I was really keen to move beyond the personal thing. It's really easy with shame just to see it as a personal thing, but I wanted to look beyond that, and so I came up with a sort of six-fold typology to look at it. The first one was personal, because many of the stories people told me in an anonymous survey I did were very personal. And I think one of the things I find particularly interesting is that the stories come from both sides of the spectrum, well, all across the entire theological spectrum. People feel shame over different sorts of things. And then I talk about communal shame, and there are groups who I think shame. You've just mentioned some of them in some of the things that you were saying. And I think there is shame which happens on a communal basis, and then there's relational shame. The whole thing about vicarious shame, I think, is fascinating, and I wondered whether you hinted at that in what you were saying about your reaction to the church, Stephen.
Yeah, I mean, it's, yeah, I suppose so. I mean, we are bound up. I mean, I think this is one of the great strengths of Judith Russell's book, Forbidden Fruit and Fig Leaves, is that she draws out the fact that we are bound up in a web of what we've often called sin, but sin is related to things like alienation, to guilt and to shame, and it's a complicated story. But we can find ourselves kind of feeling ashamed of things that, in a sense, have got nothing to do with us, sort of thing. I mean, when the bishops of the Church of England say they're ashamed about what happened to abuse victims, are they saying they're ashamed about things they've done, or ashamed that they're associated with a community that has actually systematically deafed out people who are victims and so on? So, I mean, that category is a very useful one. And I think one of the things about creating these typologies is that, of course, as soon as you've created a typology, you want to create a subtypology, don't you? Which kind of makes it even more subtle. And I think that's one of the interesting things about shame, is that, you know, just putting on an entirely academic hat, which is not the reason that we're involved in this conversation, but that actually over time, you can see understandings of shame getting more and more subtle. And what was once, when I wrote that book in 2000, a great big block of, sort of stuff, is becoming more and more nuanced, and we're understanding better where shame arrives and who does it and why people feel the way they do and so on and so forth. And I mean, personally, I completely rejoice in that. I think academically, it's a very interesting subject to study, but I've got lots of sort of reservations about it as well, because one of the problems with shame is, you know, put it bluntly, it's a bit like shit. You can't control it, you know, it goes all over the place. And people who think you can manage shame in such a way that it's creative and helpful, I think, a deluded sort of thing, because part of the nature of it is that it's out of control and it goes everywhere. So, for example, it only takes somebody to say to a child who they've just abused, by the way, you mustn't tell anybody about this. And they may not even have known that they were being abused, and they may not even have known that something awful was happening, although they might very well have done, for them to be landed with this shame, which lives with them for a lifelong, you know, which is one of the things that abuse victims are telling us, is that, you know, I was this sort of person, and then my life was stolen from me and I became so, and that great wodge of shame has just been plonked on them and doesn't go anywhere. Anyway, this takes a bit away from what you were saying about communal shame, which is just one of these strands of shame, isn't it? And where it lands up and what it does.
Yeah. And another thing I talked about was the whole idea of structural shame. And again, I was speaking to someone recently about how she feels shame if she's forced to act outside of her values and her core beliefs. And I think sometimes the structures of the church mean that we act outside the values of the belief. And again, it happens in all parts of the theological spectrum. And it's that sort of classic thing when the hairdresser asks, "What do you do?" What do you apply to them? One of the things that grieved me in one of my focus groups, I had someone who was an arts worker, and she was working with a group of women who worked on the street, and she said she was very evasive about what she did because she didn't want them to think that she was disapproving of them. She thought the minute she said who she worked for, they would sort of feel shame and not want to trust her because they would automatically assume what her attitudes and values were. I think there's also a whole lot of sort of theological shame around, and I talk about how we can be associative or dissociative. And I think depending on what church we're at or what group we're in or who we're talking to, there are things which help us associate, and there are things that we dissociate from, and there are things which feel very, very dissonant to us. And as someone that's done quite a lot of youth work, I think particularly I found in younger people there's a strong sense of dissonance about the shame that some people feel that the church puts on people around lifestyle choices, and they just really don't understand why it isn't live and let live. And I think it'd be interesting to see how some of the generations coming through will see shame differently.
Yeah, of course, different generations feel shame about different things. So there was a guy in Finland, a friend of mine, who did a study of letters that young women and then their grandmothers wrote. And the grandmothers who were growing up in Finland in the 50s and 60s were ashamed of having sex, and the grandchildren were ashamed of not having sex, if you see what I mean. So it can, you know, that's one of a good example of how what you are ashamed of can change over time, and what happens there. I mean, the typology I might like to introduce here, Sally, is one about ideas, languages, and practices, which is what I talked about in 2000. And I think and I get this from Margaret Kane's wonderful book, What Kind of God, which nobody will have read because it was published about 40 years ago. But she said theology and ideas and practices align together, sort of thing. And I think there's a lot of theological work to be done about, for example, our images of God and how whether God is embodied or not, or how God can be embodied, which was a thing that I tried to explore a little bit in my second book called Saving Face. Because if God is not embodied, then bodily experience is kind of like difficult to square. And although we've talked a lot in the recent years about bringing bodies into churches and making people feel happy with their bodies and their sexuality and so on and so forth, there's still a sense in which there's a relationship between the God we have, who's still called Lord and Father and all of those things routinely in liturgy and so on, and a sort of church which, as the commission last week about child abuse said, is bound up with clericalism and hierarchy. And so these theological ideas are not just innocent, and they don't just need reinterpretation. They are actually supporting a whole way of thinking about the world, which can in itself not help people to feel a good sense of themselves. So, you know, Melanie Klein says the child should dance and sing, but we introduce children to a God who kind of in some ways is the guarantor of order and parental control and all of those kinds of things. I mean, I know people say, well, we don't really do that anymore, but actually, I think this stuff still is around and it's in our DNA. And as theologians, we need to take responsibility. I mean, personally, having worked as a theologian all my life, this is one of the places where we need to do real work on shame, not just about sort of tweaking things at the edges, but actually saying, if we're taking shame seriously and the damage it can do, And I realise that you make a distinction between disgrace shame and what's the word?
Discretion shame.
Discretion shame. So discretion shame might be a good thing, but disgrace shame is a kind of like, discretion shame is something that reminds people that they should be connected to other people and that they have responsibilities and relationships with them, whereas disgrace shame is the sort of shame that takes people away into a world where they're not bothered about other people's and are disconnected. I still think there's a lot of work that we need to do theologically about the sort of God that we purport to worship and the sort of nicknames that we call God, because we don't know who and what God is in all respects and so on, and nor should we. And there's a real work to be done to think about how we can have better symbols and images and ways of doing liturgy, which is some of the stuff that you come onto in your book, that actually allow more space for people, embodied people, to feel themselves to be part of a community which is not in itself casting a huge shadow inadvertently or directly over people who the last thing they need is more shadow of death in their lives.
Yeah.
Do you want to say any more about, talk a little bit about the sort of things you're wanting to suggest about how we could make progress with this sort of thing?
Yeah, I think we've probably got to the question and answer time because Andrea and Catherine have appeared on the screen, but I think hopefully that's out in the, it's such a big subject for 15 minutes.
Huge,
Yes.
huge, yes, yes.
Absolutely. I mean, this is really an introduction, which then hopefully people will go away and look at the books and discuss more, because we're just able to really introduce some of the themes and some of the questions. But people have been asking some questions in the chat, which I'd like to put to you. So one of them is how do we change liturgy so that it makes space for victims of sin?
Do try and tackle some of that in the book. One of my friends, when I was writing the book and talking to him about liturgy, from pioneer minister on an outer estate church, he says we should ask of all of our liturgy, how is this understood? How does a sort of a non-church, unchurched person understand what it is that we're saying? Stephen mentioned his book Saving Face, and there's quite a bit of literature. Neil Pembroke's quite good on this, about for things like confession and absolution. Actually, we should think about how we involve shame in that, and how most of our confession and absolution is very, very sin focused. But actually, if we think about shame, and actually one way of looking at absolution is having an image of Jesus, and we ask people to look at that image and respond to the gaze, the positive gaze of Christ. But there's things about sort of language we use. I'm very grateful to be in a church that's very conscious of the language that we use for God, and gendered language, and all those sorts of things. But that sort of crucial question: how is this understood? I think it is core to it, but I do talk a little bit more and have quite a few examples of different ways of doing liturgy in the book, all different sorts of people, most of it written specifically for the book, and in a sense gives models about how you might want to include things in it. So just
Okay, also to perhaps broaden that out a little bit away from just liturgy, how do churches need to change in order to be addressing this issue of shame?
I kick off on that one, Sally. Would that be a good thing? So I think the first thing is for people to sort of, I mean, one of the problems is the church has sometimes over-identified itself with a good God and seen itself as being godly. And I think if we, one of the great gifts of the dreadful things that have happened with the abuse of children, not only in Church of England, but in the Catholic Church, is that it's shown that the church is an institution like any other institution and is fallible and so on and so forth. So one of the things the churches need to do is to recognize that they are earthly and embodied and human like any other institution, that not everything that they do is good, that our theologies and practices and so on are capable of casting a shadow over other people. So acknowledging that, taking responsibility for that is very important. Then trying to understand in our communities and in our individual practices how some of the things that we do might actually shame other people, and try to make opportunities for people to actually reflect on that. So not being innocent, taking yourself and your own sinful engagement in the world of shame, whether intended or not, seriously, and then trying to become aware of it and trying to see its effects in other people is a starting point. Sally's got some more specific ideas about that, so perhaps you could chip in there, Sally.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really important to say is that shame is very much a cultural phenomenon, and too many of our churches have cultural standards of what it means to be a Christian that have nothing to do with the gospel, the Bible, or anything. So I think one of the things that we can do is be more welcoming, be less labelling, and try and build the idea that something's a safe place. I mean, people just really concerned, even with young children, the number of people that turn around and touch at them if their child makes a noise. Part of it is educating a congregation to be welcoming, to be understanding, and to realise that we're all at different stages, have different issues that we're facing, and it's really important to be welcoming and accepting of the people who are coming to church, and not make it a place that feels alien. I have people saying, I'm really not sure about carrying on going to church because they just make me feel bad about myself or my situation or about what I can commit. And that's horrible. You know, as a priest, I hate the idea that someone would come to church and feel, I don't want to go back there because they just made me feel bad about where I'm at.
Yes, and I think there are some comments in the chat that are reflecting that experience. Another sort of area of interest is around the idea of shame, not just as a cognitive understanding, but as a matter of the primitive brain, or the sort of, I guess, tapping into that very child emotional response that we have at quite a deep formative level. And I just wondered if you have any comments on that difference between perhaps the cognitive understanding of shame and then the feeling and this sort of primitive reaction that is manifest when we experience shame.
I think, Stephen, you talk about this a bit in your writing more so than I do.
I mean, if you've never seen a little film about Still Face by a man called Tronick, that's the quickest way of getting at this sort of visceral sense of shame. What he does is he has a mother and a child. It's almost unbearable to watch. I've watched it loads of times and I still find it unbearable. And the mother is then plays with the child and then is required to adopt a still face. And you can see the child getting more and more distressed and becoming sort of puzzled and then getting angry and all sorts of things. And if you can imagine that if this still face experience is experienced time and time again through people's lives, they become chronically shamed. That's the persona they adopt and they withdraw and then, but shame returns us into ourselves. A child is returned into itself. The relationship, the dynamic, playful relationship is kind of disrupted. And over time, then a child, I suppose, comes to think, well, I'm the wrong child, I'm the wrong person, I'm in the wrong place, must be something wrong with me because nobody's responding to me and I'm being, and this is a sort of one of the ways in which the human race kind of teaches people what it's like to be us, you know, and one of the things about being a church is if we're an us, there's going to be a them, and if there's a them, there's going to be shame, and we can't avoid that sort of thing. And it can be visceral. So, for example, if somebody walks into your church and says, I'm a paedophile, you're probably going to have a visceral sense of disgust about this sort of thing. We all have visceral sense of disgust about things that are, you know, or how people look, or possibly other races or whatever. It's a prejudice system that is set up and that it is visceral. And when we experience shame, we're thrust into ourselves. Suddenly we're on our own and we don't have any words and we don't have any language, just like that baby. And we can't avoid that. But what we can do is try and think, well, this is what's happening and this is the implication and this is where it's taking me. And, you know, one of the challenges, for example, with in churches is to say there are people who are paedophiles, there are people who have abused people, or clergy have abused people, Peter Ball has abused people. How do we as churches, as a community, not abandon them and not abandon ourselves, you know? And that's the real struggle here, isn't it? Because our sense of disgust and shame can be so visceral that it just cuts all bonds between us. And I think part of our challenge is to kind of think, what are the bonds that we need to affirm in order that shame does not do its destructive work, as opposed to work that reminds us that we are human beings with responsibilities to other human beings.
That's really helpful, thank you. So someone else is asking, can Sally say a bit more about vicarious shame, please? I'm conscious of feeling shame about people I previously admired who have been shown in a different light in the child abuse report.
Absolutely. We can feel shame because of actions that other people have taken, and we may or may not have a relationship with them. So a recent one for me is Jean Vanier, who's found to had abusive relationships with women. I'm going through my books. I have 2 actually brilliant books for him, but I have that dilemma of now feeling a sense of shame of recommending books written by someone who was living living a dual life. So there's a whole big discussion about, you know, books and all that sort of thing. But we can feel shame because someone we associate with, admire, etc., does something wrong, and it can actually still be a really powerful feeling that we have. So you know, some of us will have experienced it with family members, for example, when they do something. I mean, I remember feeling dreadful when a cousin was in a local newspaper because he pinched some stuff from a supermarket, and that was, you know, I felt shame, although probably no one would have known because different sorts of names, but we feel shame because of what other people did, and it sometimes is no less powerful, particularly if we put them on a pedestal, we've admired them, and it really hits our trust. It's really can be really damaging, because if that person isn't trustworthy, I think sometimes it impacts our relationship with God. If that person was a key person mediating God to us, I think, but if that person wasn't trustworthy, how can I trust God if, in a sense, that person did that? It can have a really strong impact.
Yeah, we've only got a couple of minutes left, so I just wondered if we've got quite a big question around, is the church redeemable when it's seen through the lens of shame? Do we need to try to create safe spaces within the institution as it is, or walk away from the institution and try again from scratch? How would you respond to that?
I don't think you can walk away from things. I think that this idea, there's an idea.
For me, I've only been ordained for 8 years, and so I made the choice to try and work on shame from within the institution, not outside of the institution. I believe God can redeem anything, and anyone. So I would have that belief. I don't know what you want to say, Stephen.
Yes, I think there's no place of innocence. You know, the church isn't innocent, but nor is British Petroleum or the House of Commons or any other institution you can think of. So unless you think you're going to have institutions on some planet that I've not yet come across, you're going to have shame. And the point is not to kind of try and escape shame, but to try and work with it in order to make sure that it's not as pernicious as it might be. And if you can do something to deflect and control the flow of shame and be conscious of it, that's a very good thing. And that's as much as we can do. And that's us taking responsibility for our own sinfulness. So I'm a great believer in original sin. And as Sally knows, one of my phrases is, less shame, more guilt. And I think we should get to a point where we can take more responsibility for what's going on, realizing that as human beings, we're never going to be in a perfect world able to stand on a pedestal and say, this is, you know, thank God we've now got a shame-free environment. It isn't going to happen. What's going to happen is we're going to become more responsive and more responsible and more knowledgeable about the environment in which we're in, so that perhaps people are less hurt and there's more chance for restoration and learning from it, rather than just fleeing from it and being frightened of it and pretending it doesn't exist in our organization, which means we've kind of completely got rid of a whole load of people who are not like us, which is exactly what shame will do.
That's brilliant. I think that's probably a place to pause for the minute, and just to say thank you so much for your contribution, and we really appreciate having you both here. And I know for me particularly, Stephen, your book in 2000 was a revelation, and I know many of us started. That was where our shame journey of discovery really started, was with your groundbreaking work. So I just want to say on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for what you've brought to our attention. And I think any of us who've written about shame or have talked about shame know that there's a cost to that, because it taps into our own stuff, and we have to overcome our own shame in order to make this issue more aware and in the public domain. So thank you for that, and thank you, Sally, as well, because you're now taking that and bringing it to a new audience and a different level. So thank you.